Hi, welcome to this weekend's concert, which is also our annual Beethoven and Blue Jeans program. So naturally, we do have works by Beethoven that are featured. There are two works by Beethoven. We open the concert with Overture to Fidelio, and then we close the concert with Beethoven's Second Symphony, Symphony Number 2. And in between the two works by Beethoven, we will be playing a recent work by an old friend of mine from high school, actually, James Lee III, his recent piece called Emotive Transformations. So that's what's on the docket for tonight's program, and I'm glad that you can tune in. We're going to start by talking about the two works by Beethoven. The Overture to Fidelio, when we think of Beethoven, when we think of composers like Mozart, for instance, he's probably best known for his operas. He wrote so many operas that are part of the standard operatic repertoire today. In addition to, of course, many outstanding instrumental works, solo works, chamber music, symphonies, concertos, and so on. When we think of Beethoven, perhaps many people think of works such as his Ninth Symphony or the Fifth Symphony, of course. Maybe some of the piano sonatas that he wrote, or if you're a fan of chamber music, maybe some of the string quartets that he's written. One doesn't quite often think of Beethoven in terms of his writing for the voice, whether it's solo works for voice, or in this case, opera. As a matter of fact, he actually only wrote one opera during his lifetime, which then was revised later, and it was called by a different name. So Fidelio was really Fidelio is the final form of this opera that took over a decade for him between the conception, the first composition, and the revision, as what is known today as Fidelio. Equally complicated in a way is the story of the overture. When we think of operatic overtures, they tend to be sometimes very short, brief things that instrumental. Literally, it was there to accommodate for the late comers into this theater and to sort of get the audience quiet down and get in the zone, so to speak, for the action that's to come. As a matter of fact, a lot of operatic overtures by Mozart, for instance, they led directly into the first number of the opera itself. So it was more functional in a sense. The part of the problem or challenge that Beethoven faced when he wrote the first form of Fidelio, which was called Leonore, was that he wrote such an extensive dramatic overture that lasts for about 13 minutes that it was sort of a piece in its own. And he realized that the piece was perhaps too great to serve as a mere curtain raiser. So then he kept on revising this overture. As we know, there are 4 different overtures to this opera that he ended up writing throughout this a decade-long process. Overture to Fidelio is sort of his final answer to this question. How do I write an overture to this particular opera? And as a result, it is the most concise. It is the shortest of the 4 overtures. It serves as perfectly sort of this idea of opening the operatic action. Also, it works out perfectly to open a concert as well. Fidelio, or Leonore, is what we call rescue opera. So in this case, Leonore is the main heroine, main female character, and her husband has become a political prisoner. So the story is that Leonore disguises herself as a man, Fidelio, and infiltrates the prison to rescue her husband, Florestan. And it has become a sort of a popular opera speaking up against political injustice and so on. But so that's sort of what the rescue opera is. And again, as I mentioned, the piece is fairly brief. It opens with a very short fanfare-like motif that you will keep on hearing throughout the piece that alternates with this very peaceful duet between the two horns that are also taken up by different pairs of the winds throughout the orchestra as well. Some of the hallmarks you hear in his other works, such as the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies, which we performed last year and so on, are still evident. So sometimes kind of placing the rhythmic emphasis on what we consider a weak beat in succession happens. So it's almost like speaking, kind of placing, if you were speaking, all of a sudden you're putting a strong emphasis on the wrong part of the word, on the wrong syllable, for instance. And that was sort of one of the ways in which Beethoven liked to kind of play with the listener's mind and also create tension in his music. So you will hear a lot of those ideas as well. At the end of the program, we go back a little bit to 1802 when he was, so go back almost like a decade, basically, a little more than a decade from the Fidelio Overture to his Second Symphony. And 1802 was an interesting year for Beethoven. For some time before this, he had been dealing with the ringing in his ear, or this weird noise he was hearing in his ear, and also he was noticing he was hard of hearing. So his hearing problems were sort of the initial onset of that. A big problem had happened a year or two before this, and he had consulted various different doctors. All these doctors prescribed different remedies or suggested different remedies, including things like dipping a cotton swab in olive oil and stuffing that in your ear and see if that works. Different system back then, I suppose. So he was trying all of these things, but problems persisted. And he realized at this point that this was going to be a problem that he probably will likely have to deal with for the rest of his life. And likely it will continue to get worse. His hearing will continue to get worse until he eventually obviously became completely deaf much later. So he realizes that as a composer, the one sense out of five senses that he needed to rely on the most, his sense of hearing, was the one that was going to go, and he was devastated. And in the autumn of 1802, some of you probably are familiar with this document that he wrote to his brothers. It was called Heiligenstadt Testament. Heiligenstadt was a country town. One of the doctors said, "Why don't you get away from the city as in Vienna, and spend some time out in the country?" So that's what he liked to do. As you know, he loved nature. He loved taking walks along in the countryside to really focus his mind as well. But also at the same time, he wasn't really the most social person either. And with the onset of this hearing problem, he was starting to become even more introverted in a sense, because he was in a way, I think he was embarrassed to try to talk to people, only to have them realize that he was having some hearing problems. So he was kind of finding more solace and peace just by being by himself, taking a walk outside in the countryside and so on. So he spent some time in Heiligenstadt, and he wrote this testament. Basically talks about his hearing problems, even to the point where he basically saying that it's hard to imagine him being able to continue to be successful or try to be successful as a composer, as a musician, with this problem, with the hearing problem, to the point where he in some days he was contemplating sort of suicidal thoughts in a way, because he felt like his future was pretty much shut down. And then sometimes he would feel more optimistic about, the quote of sort of grabbing the fate by its throat. So it was, how it is when we are faced with challenges. There are some good days and there are some bad days. And so you see sort of the wide gamut of his emotions and how he was trying to cope with everything in his life in this document. In that same year, he penned this symphony number 2. if you don't know any of this backstory and heard the symphony, one might find this symphony to be very cheerful, energetic, humorous, perhaps, especially in the final two movements. As a matter of fact, this is the first symphony. Well, the second symphony, so it's not such a hot take. But this is really the first time that he used, instead of a traditional minuet format for one of the symphony movements, he replaces what was minuet in, if you looked at his first symphony, or symphonies by Haydn, Mozart before him. They all used a minuet form as one of the movements of the symphony. He replaced it with what he calls scherzo. Now, scherzo is really, it's still in 3/4 time, but it's in 1. You think of waltz being in 1, but it's really a treble time, but it's in 1. Scherzo is a lot faster usually than minuet, so it's more energetic. And the way he wrote this particular scherzo is also it's really a joke. There are a lot of these kind of little jokey dialogues that's happening among the various instruments. You will see the violin sort of placed stereophonically, antiphonally across the stage. The reason why we do that when we perform symphonies by Beethoven, for instance, like this one, is that there are a lot of interesting dialogue that happen between the first violins and the second violins. And it's a perfect way to bring out the contrast if they're really kind of sitting across from each other and have that distance. So from a listener's standpoint, especially if you're listening to the live stream through your AirPods or earphone or headphones or what have you, you will be able to hear this kind of effect of it's the same music coming in quick succession as a quick chatter or dialogue between the different sides of the stage. So that's why he does what he does also in the final movement. It's almost like a little bit of it's if he ended in the middle of the movement and just sort of tacked on an ending to it, it would have been perfect ending. It's an energetic, very virtuosic finale that one might expect from Beethoven, but he goes further by sort of adding a little bit of this extended section, what we sort of call coda, at the end of this movement, which is almost like he's thumbing his nose at us. It's almost like, it's literally like this kind of thing musically going on. And so that's hard to imagine that he was going through what he was going through when you hear this piece, because it's so sunny, energetic, optimistic, cheerful and humorous for most part. You will still hear some of those intense accents, the displaced rhythmic emphasis. It still foreshadows Eroica Symphony, which many people consider that piece to be sort of the true start of Romantic period, where Beethoven just broke completely new ground. But it's always interesting to see when we have musical pieces or any piece of art that's considered revolutionary or was just groundbreaking, to look at a piece that came just before it and see if you can see that trace. Sort of, were there signs of Eroica in the second symphony? And I think you would agree that the answer is yes. Even though it is such in a sense, it might be an extension of late Haydn or late Mozart symphonies, just the grand scale in which he operates, how he would take the minute or minuscule musical units and the way he could spin this thing to develop it into a grand section, as he does in Eroica. You can see that, or you can hear that already in this particular symphony. So it's one of the least often performed symphonies by Beethoven. Usually, people hear the Ninth Symphony, Ode to Joy, of course, the aforementioned Eroica, the Fifth Symphony, the famous Fifth Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, the Sixth or the Seventh. Those are probably the most often perform symphonies by Beethoven. But there's so many other gems in the other symphonies as well. So I'm glad that we are bringing to you here the Second Symphony of Beethoven for this particular concert. In between the two works by Beethoven, as I mentioned, we are playing a relatively recent piece. It has only been performed once before by the Louisville Orchestra last year. It was a piece by James Lee III, as I mentioned, was my high school classmate, class of 1994 at Andrews Academy, and a piece called Emotive Transformations. And a few days ago, I had a chance to catch up with James over Zoom and to chat a little bit in depth about what he's been up to with his career since we went our separate ways after graduation, and in particular about the piece that you're going to hear. So enjoy the video, and once again, thank you so much for tuning in to this pre-concert talk and to the concert as well. Hopefully you enjoy. James Lee III, who is joining us today from the Baltimore area, I believe, where he is the professor of composition at the Morgan State University. And James and I go back. I was just thinking about this. This is year 2021. So we met like almost exactly 30 years ago when I came to the US in the spring of 1991 to a little town in southwestern Michigan called Berrien Springs, Michigan. And I came from Japan to attend Andrews Academy. And we were classmates during the rest of the high school years. So those three plus years of high school, we were classmates, and knew James first as this amazing pianist who introduced me to both composers and also specific piano works. But then I also got to know James as a composer as well. My first time conducting an orchestra in a concert was James wrote an honors thesis, right, James? The piano concerto that you wrote. Yeah, and we put together an orchestra for that, and I got to conduct it. And before that, I had only conducted wind ensembles, so that was really my first time. Wow. For my first time conducting an orchestra, and then and that's sort of how things got started. So it's so great to be joined by you, James, today, and we're looking forward to performing and presenting your Emotive Transformations, one of the orchestral works, recent orchestral works that we are featuring on this program on Beethoven Blue Jeans. So welcome, James. And I thought, well, first of all, how are you doing during the pandemic?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here. It's very good to be here and to see you again, after hearing about what you've been doing. So it's nice to be able to chat again after all these years. But during the pandemic, I've been, doing well. Actually, I'm in good health, and I've been very busy. I don't think I've ever had as many projects or commissions as I had this past year.
That's great.
Still coming. So I have been quite active and happily active.
That's great. And I know we went sort of to separate paths or so after high school graduation. I went on to Andrews University, and you went to University of Michigan. So, and you studied composition there, and then of course your music is now commissioned. You're commissioned by, your music is performed by all the the leading ensembles of the world, especially here in the U.S., like the Chicago Symphony, Boston Symphony, National Symphony, to name a few. So, but kind of going back further, like before we met. Back in '91, so I know you started on the piano and so on. What was your sort of musical origin story, so to speak, and how did you become interested in composition?
Well, my father registered me for piano lessons I think it was in the 7th grade or so, when I was 12 years old. So late, in childhood, that's a late age to start piano. But I used to listen to, of course, church music, having grown up in the church, and then some popular music. But once I started piano lessons, I just really fell in love with classical music. And I started to really enjoy all the works that I was listening to. And then, of course, during the high school years and the college years. So I really embraced that for a while. But then at the academy in high school in Berrien Springs, I started to become a little more interested in composition. So I was writing on the side, and I actually won a talent contest that they had there. So I thought I was going to be this wonderful pianist until I finished my undergrad, and I was thinking, I think I probably want to write some etudes more than play them. So I thought about, it's great to be this pianist, this wonderful pianist, and do these programs, but I really wanted to explore composition more than piano. I think I would become too nervous to be a pianist of note,
So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but during the high school days, wasn't there a piece by Prokofiev that you were playing, or there was some Prokofiev connection? I remember.
I was studying the first piano concerto.
That's right.
Yeah, the D flat.
Yep.
Piano concerto. Yeah, I was studying that. I don't know if I played much Prokofiev. I think back then I was playing a lot of Liszt, like the
Transcendental Etudes, right?
Yeah.
That was the other thing I specifically remember, was the Franz Liszt, and then there was a piece by you, the one who introduced me to the music of William Grant Still.
Oh yes, yeah. I've been playing Three Visions since then.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it was great to talk about music, talk about different composers, and hear what you're working on the piano. And what was that? Did you, and so, as far as, so did you have your favorite, who were your favorite composers then? Like, I guess Liszt and so on, I guess
probably a lot of pianists, Liszt, Chopin, of course, Beethoven, Brahms also. But you were actually the one who introduced me to large ensemble music more. I was this piano geek, but you introduced me to like wind band music and orchestral music, and even giving away some CDs with some of those works. So I remember really becoming more interested in orchestral music and wind band music, especially in college, like my later years in college. Then of course graduate school. But probably in my junior year or so, I started to listen to more large ensemble music.
And you study. Let's see. Did you study with? Was it William Bolcom?
I did.
Was your main teacher, but you also study with like Michael Dougherty and Bright Shen.
Yeah, we would have opportunities each year to study with someone different. So I studied with Bolcom at one point. James Aikman there. Betsy Jolas came when Bolcom was on sabbatical one year, so I studied with her some, and Susan Bhatti doing the masters, and then the doctorate was Bright Sheng and Michael Dougherty.
Okay, yeah.
Yes. So I think only those two during my doctoral time there.
And University of Michigan. I mean, it's a great music program. Obviously, the school music there is huge, but I've always admired the composition program there. So you did all of your degrees there, right, at Michigan?
I did.
Yeah,
I did. I mean, I loved it. I had a great time there.
Yeah,
I don't regret any of it.
Yeah, and Ann Arbor is such a great town as well. So there's that. But and then obviously you've been as you mentioned earlier, you're keeping yourself very busy, right? I was at just a few days ago. On the same day, I think the Kennedy Center announced their upcoming season, for which you're writing a piece commemorating the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and then also the Baltimore Symphony announced their upcoming season, and they're premiering a new piece of yours as well. So, how has that process of doing these new works commissions and keeping up the schedule and so on, I mean, and while you're also teaching, how long have you been at Morgan State now?
Since 2005.
Oh, okay.
It's been a while, a good while. I think around 16 years now.
Yeah. So it was right after you finished your doctoral degree, basically?
Exactly. I finished in the spring, and I was at Morgan in the late summer by August.
Okay. Yeah. That's great. So how is that sort of the life of composer whose work is in much demand across the world, and having this teaching career as well? How do you juggle and balance everything, and where do you keep on finding your new inspirations?
Well, it's a challenge to juggle all of that. I always joke about giving less homework. I teach theory classes too, theory classes. So I joke about giving less homework so I don't have to spend as much time grading, so I can compose. Right. But yeah, I just have to. I'm pretty good about my deadlines. Like the piece for the National Symphony, I actually finished it in January this year, because I was actually offered that commission in October of 2019. So I had a good amount of time to think about it and to finish it. So I'm pretty good about, like, I always think maybe I might have another project that might come up at some point. So I always want to balance my time so that I can finish everything. So to this point, I've never been late on a commission. So that's a good a good record to have.
That's any aspiring composers listening to this out there, keep your deadlines. Right.
Exactly.
Exactly. Composers throughout history have been known to be, I mean, starting with Mozart, really, working last minute up till the last minute on commissions. But no, that's great. And can let's go on and talk a little bit about this particular piece, Emotive Transformations, which we're performing, which was premiered by the Louisville Orchestra last year, right? It was in 2020.
Yes, February of 2020.
So just before everything sort of shut down a little bit. So if you could, for our listeners out there, you could talk a little bit about the piece and sort of maybe a couple of things that they should be listening out for during the piece. It's about It's about 11 minutes. Piece?
Yeah, about 11 minutes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, this is a result of having suppressed feelings for a while. My father, you met him when we were in high school, and I had the shock of finding out that he was in stage 4 pancreatic cancer in the fall of 16. So he passed away, and then I had been thinking about how I might react to that as a composer. These emotions that were in me, what I was thinking about during that time, and then I finished some projects in 2018, and then I decided to write this. This was not a commission. This was something that I just wanted to write, and I always wanted to write for a type of classical sized orchestra. So this basically is like a chamber orchestra sized piece. So I was thinking about how I would approach this piece and call it Emotive Transformations, the kind of stages of grief one might experience after having lost a loved one. So it begins with this agitated figure in the violas, and as that continues, then this kind of 2-note idea, this kind of crying out that is basically transformed throughout the composition. And then in order to try to use some sort of academic training, I have like a loosely connected sonata form idea where I'm connecting various themes where they end up being developed and enhanced upon in the texture, so that more instruments are playing than you might have heard at the beginning. And then there's this loud scream. Some of my music I really like. I think I'm influenced by Shostakovich, some of his pacing and his densities at certain points. So I really wanted to stretch the ranges of the strings at one part. So they're basically kind of screaming, but not over the top. So they come to this climax, and then there's this moment where they are just becoming a little more quiet and dying out. And then we have this kind of hope for a resurrection, to see your loved one again. So it becomes a little more beautiful, and then a little more restless, but then kind of triumphant with this explosive chord at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a, and one of the, to me, one of the trademarks of your music, and I feel like it's, when was it 2000? When I was teaching at Andrews, we commissioned you a piece, right, while you were still at Michigan.
Oh yeah, I think it was 2002, something like that,
or something like that. But I've been following your other works too, for especially for orchestra, as well. There was always this sense of bold, powerful energy that's always in your music, and it's always very rhythmic. Kind of reminds me of those high school days where you were playing all these, and I mean, I didn't realize you started playing the piano when you were 12, because I mean, the virtuosic ability of your playing was just always so striking to me, even back in high school too, and that sense of energy is always evident in your music. This bold musical gestures, but then also this sense of this singing lines too, sort of kind of going back to our church background, upbringing, as well. So all of that, and how even though you're using essentially this is you're using a very classical size orchestra, for this piece, as opposed to a lot of your other works that use much bigger forces, 80, 90 people, person orchestra. This one is basically, it's a Beethoven size orchestra for this piece. It's actually exact same instrumentation as the Beethoven second that follows this piece. But to get this range of colors and evoking all these different emotions is, it's such a powerful, powerful piece of music. So yeah, I'm definitely, looking forward to rehearsing it. As we are recording this, we're about a week out, a little more than a week out from starting the rehearsals and getting up to the performance. So just, and of course it's so rhythmic that I've been living with my metronome.
Oh.
all these weeks to make sure I'm not going to lead anybody astray here. But yeah, anything else you would like our viewers to know?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you bring up the rhythmic aspect. That's something that I've been interested in, like the rhythm of our lives, the business that we have in our lives. And I think some of the music I've heard in the past and that I've studied have influenced why I'm writing these very intricate rhythmic ideas. But I always like the contrast with like the bold gestures. I mean, just listening to Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony is like, when I heard that arrival point in this A major bright chord after all of that time, I just love the idea. Even though I don't really write for film or haven't written for film yet, I always want to think about pacing and when certain events might happen, and then appealing to the listeners in terms of the beauty of music in and of itself and those wonderful contrasts. I think that I want the music my music to have aspects of accessibility, but at the same time, the complexity that one can really, appreciate all those various contrary elements, so that once you arrive at the end, it just feels very natural. Like, wow, this is what should happen at this point in time in the music.
Yeah, it feels very like organic, right?
Mm-hmm,
Organic
exactly.
and natural. And yeah, I was hesitant to use the word, cinematic, right? Because it's not some people don't like that, but there is, as you mentioned, Shostakovich, or Mahler or so, some of these composers who have this, their music just unfolds in such a way that is very much, I guess cinematic is the best way to, describe it. And there is that sense of unfolding and leading somewhere, and the sense of arrival, that is, I think, very much inherent in this piece. So yeah, we're looking forward to it. Hopefully you can join us for the live stream.
Sure.
If our viewers during the live stream, wherever you might be, have any questions or so during, maybe even during, but during or after your piece, maybe James, I think you hopefully you'll be on hand to kind of guide them through that as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll definitely plan for that.
Yeah, and hopefully, if it weren't pandemic, obviously we would all be together in person. But we will definitely plan for that for the future. Hopefully, yeah, we'd love to get do a consortium, or get do a commission for something in the future years as well. So yeah,
sounds good.
Yeah, thank you so much, James, for joining us. And
my pleasure.
Yeah,
my pleasure.
You take care of yourself, and
you too.
Yeah, thanks. We'll see each other soon.
All right, thank you.